Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back for another episode of my Midweek mystery series, where today I want to talk about the mysterious disappearance of Agatha Christie. Yep, that's right, one of the world's most well-known murder mystery writers, Dame Agatha Christie, went missing herself, and the story has all of the elements of one of her books. She may well have written her own disappearance. Maybe she really did. This is a completely true story, although luckily she did make a reappearance safe and well. 100 years since these events and there's still no credible answer as to what happened to her. But first, I want to share with you the sponsor of this video, Star on Disney+, who this month have a bunch of brand new and utterly unmissable shows streaming exclusively on the service. The final season of The Walking Dead is currently streaming. The new dystopian drama Why the Last Man is coming out on the 22nd of September, but the one I'm most excited to talk to you about is Only Murders in the Building, which I've just started watching and I've been absolutely loving it. It's a mystery comedy series featuring Selena Gomez and comedy legends Steve Martin and Martin Short, about three strangers all living in the same building who share one common interest: their obsession with a true crime podcast. When a death occurs in their own apartment block, they decide to start their own podcast to document their investigation, and it's a race against time as the trio try to figure out who the killer is before it's too late. The show is funny and smart, centred around the concept of true crime without being too dark or disrespectful at any point. It pokes fun at a true crime podcast but keeps things light. As the episodes go on, more tidbits are revealed about each of the characters and their own personal motivations for being so interested in this death. And my personal favourite character is Mabel, who's played by Selena Gomez. Mabel is super smart and fashionable, and she's not all that interested in socialising, and she's everything I aspire to be in real life, minus her dark secrets. I can't wait to see what happens with this character as the series progresses, as well as find out what actually happens. You can enjoy Only Murders in the Building and all that Star on Disney Plus has to offer for just $7.99 a month. Just click on the link in my description to check it out. Dame Agatha Christie was born September 1890 into a wealthy upper middle class family in Torquay in Devon. Agatha was homeschooled throughout most of her childhood and was said to be a voracious reader from a very young age. She read everything she could get her hands on. She wrote her first poem aged just 10, entitled The Cowslip. Shortly after this though, her father died and Agatha was sent to school for the first time, but she found it difficult to deal with the levels of discipline at school. In 1905 she was sent to a boarding school in Paris where she was to train to become a concert pianist or an opera singer, but she simply just didn't have the skills. As we all know, Agatha's skills laid elsewhere. It was at 18 that she wrote her first short story called The House of Beauty, which focused on the topics of madness and dreams. Many of her early stories would feature the paranormal and spiritualism, which were interests of hers at the time. She would send all her short stories to magazines for publication, but all of her early submissions were repeatedly rejected. Not one to give up though, she also begins working on her first novel, Snow Upon the Desert, under a pseudonym Monosyllaba. Again, this book was declined by 6 different publishers, but Agatha persisted. She knew that she was a writer. When she was 22 years old, she met Archibald Christie, or just Archie to pretty much everyone, and he would later be known as Colonel Archibald Christie. Agatha had had a string of failed relationships up to this point, including one failed engagement, but she quickly fell in love with Archie and he with her. 3 months later they got engaged, and after a brief interlude where he went off to fight in the First World War, the two would marry on Christmas Eve in 1914, and he would quickly return back to war after that. 5 years later, Agatha gave birth to her one and only child, Rosalind, and then the year after that, in 1920, she finally got her first novel published, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. This was also the first of her books featuring Hercule Poirot, the fictional Belgian detective. Agatha had long been a fan of detective novels and had decided to turn her own hand to the genre, and you could say this worked out pretty well for her. The book was rejected by a couple of publishers at first, but eventually, with a few tweaks, a publisher accepted it and her life would change forever. She signed a contract committing to 5 more books, and over the next couple of years released The Secret Adversary and her second Poirot novel, Murder on the Links. They flew off the shelves. With the money she made, the family moved to Sunningdale in Berkshire, so not far outside of London. She named her new home Styles after the mansion in her first book. But Agatha was sensible. She was careful with her money and her newfound fame, and insisted on a modest lifestyle. This was likely because, despite being born into an upper middle class family born into great wealth, they had a descent into poverty after her father died, so she'd learned to be careful with finances and didn't want that to happen to her own daughter. In April 1926, Agatha's mother Clarissa died from bronchitis. The two had had a very close relationship, and the death hit Agatha really hard. The newspapers at the time reported that she'd had a breakdown and had to head to a secluded village to recuperate from this. And the year wouldn't get much better for her after that. Later that same year, Archie asked her for a divorce. Some reports say that it was Agatha's tight purse strings that led to the demise of their marriage, but it's more likely the fact that he'd begun an affair with his 25-year-old secretary, Nancy Neal. Agatha was 36 years old and her world was falling apart. And this is where our mystery begins on the evening of the 3rd of December 1926. Archie had asked Agatha for a divorce months earlier, reportedly in the August, but as we all know, a divorce isn't a quick or an easy process, particularly in the 20s. The couple was still together in the December and they were far from happy. They quarrelled constantly. That night, Archie told Agatha that he had plans to go and spend the weekend with friends, which didn't go down all too well, especially as his mistress Nancy was also going to be there. Whilst the public didn't know about Archie's affair, Agatha very much did. She'd officially had enough. That evening, she packs a bag, goes upstairs to kiss her daughter goodbye, leaves a note for her secretary saying that she wouldn't be returning that night, and drives off at around 9:45 p.m. and she disappeared. For the next 11 days, the papers would follow the story with intrigue, and believe me, there were plenty of intriguing things to be reporting on. On the 6th of December, her disappearance made the front page of the Times, as it was announced that at 8 p.m. on the 4th of December, Agatha's car had been found abandoned near Guildford in Surrey at Newlands Corner, which was about half an hour away from her home in Sunningdale. It was found on the edge of a chalk cliff, the wheels hanging over the edge. It seemed like the car had crashed. It was half in a thick hedge, which was luckily the only thing that stopped the whole car from plunging into the chalk pit. In the car, some clothing items were found, as well as an attaché case, which is a small thin briefcase type bag, filled with papers. Some sources even say that the headlights had been left on as well. That weekend, more than 100 policemen searched for Agatha for miles around, but there was no trace of her. This was said to be one of the largest manhunts the country had ever seen at the time. For the first time ever, airplanes were even involved in the search, which was just unheard of. The Home Secretary at the time, William Joyson Hicks, put a lot of pressure on the police to find Agatha, and a newspaper even offered a £100 reward for any information leading to Agatha, which was an unprecedented amount of money in these times. It's equivalent to about £6,000 now. Hundreds of letters came in over the coming days to the police, claiming that she'd been seen all over the country, but most of these were dismissed by investigators. Sources do differ as to the level of Agatha's fame at this point in her career. Some say that she was well known, others say that she didn't reach the point of being a household name until after this event. But from the amount of searching that was done for her, I will assume that she was fairly well known at this point. I mean, even the Home Secretary was putting pressure on the police. I suppose even now, to be a famous author, you have to write something pretty special. And Agatha's books were selling well, but she wasn't exactly front page news every day before all of this. Whilst a friend said to the media that Agatha was happy and devoted to her child, Archie said that she'd been suffering from a nervous breakdown, but they had no quarrel. Another friend would state that Agatha was struggling at her house in Sunnydale, with a New York Times article from the time writing, "It stands in a lonely lane, unlit at night, which has a reputation of being haunted. The lane has been the scene of the murder of a woman and the suicide of a man, and its tragic associations were felt by Mrs. Christie." And then, after just 3 days of searching, the bulk of the investigation was abruptly called off. It was announced that her brother-in-law, Archie's brother, had received a letter from Agatha, in which she said she'd been sick and that she was going to a Yorkshire spa for rest and treatment. But some people weren't quite satisfied with this letter. They weren't going to rest until they'd seen Agatha with their own 2 eyes, and eventually the investigation did start back up again properly, it seems. Archie brought his wife's favourite dog to the scene in the hopes that he could help them track her scent, but it just made the dog sad. It said that the dog whined pitifully before putting his nose to the ground. After 3 hours, they had to give up on the dog's scent-following abilities though. He wasn't leading them anywhere. And then rumours started to fly that Agatha may have actually committed suicide not far from where her car was found abandoned, with speculation surrounding a local pond known as the Silent Pool, which legend said was bottomless. As time went on, investigators asked for as much public assistance as they could in the search. They believed that she was still near the area where her car had crashed, and thousands of motorists and public on foot were asked to come down and search the area around Newlands Corner. Searches were organised into groups and they were then directed by detectives. And they also specifically requested owners of bloodhounds to come down and help. But despite the extensive searches, a week passed and there was still no sign of Agatha. A fellow mystery writer called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle sought out the help of a clairvoyant, using one of her gloves as a guide, but surprisingly, that did not yield any results. Another mystery writer called Dorothy L. Sayers also found herself drawn to the story. She helped with the search and later used the scene of the disappearance in her own novel, Unnatural Death. And then something huge came out in the press. Agatha had apparently left 3 letters before her disappearance. We already knew about one letter addressed to her secretary or a note, but there were reportedly also letters to her brother-in-law and husband. It was revealed that the letter to the secretary read, "I must get away. I cannot stay here in Sunnydale much longer." It told the secretary to cancel an engagement she had in Beverley, Yorkshire for that weekend as she wasn't feeling great, and that she was going out in her car and would let them know by Saturday where she was. It seems that she intended to stay in contact with the secretary at the very least, but she didn't. We don't know what the letter to the brother-in-law said, as that had been destroyed, and her husband very suspiciously also refused to reveal what was written in his letter and also destroyed his. As you can probably guess, both Colonel Archibald Christie and his mistress were considered people of interest in the disappearance. The papers had many theories about what had happened to Agatha Christie, that she had committed suicide or been abducted or that her husband had killed her. Or the most popular theory, that she had disappeared on purpose, that this was a publicity stunt, something which her secretary denied vehemently. But if that was the reason behind it, it worked. Her books flew off the shelves, with people analysing them intensely for any clues as to her whereabouts. It was speculated that she could be in London, disguised and in male attire, and Archie reportedly examined his own wardrobe carefully to see if she'd stolen any clothes. Another report came out that Agatha had apparently left a sealed envelope which was only to be opened in the event that her body was found. But as far as I was able to find, this was simply newspaper sensationalism. This didn't happen. On the 14th of December, 11 days now after her disappearance, the latest article stated that some important clues had been found close to the crash site, including a woman's tracks in powder, a fur coat, and a poison bottle. Intriguing clues for sure, but there wouldn't be time to fully look into them, because the very next day, on December 15th, 1926, Agatha Christie was found under circumstances that could have been pulled from one of her books. The police received a tip from a waiter at the Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, which is now known as the Old Swan Hotel, saying that one of their guests resembled the missing woman very closely and had checked in under the name Mrs. Tresson Neal the day after the 3rd of December. In a coincidence or not, Neal was actually the surname of Archie's mistress, Nancy Neal. This woman had also written on documents that she was from Cape Town in Africa. In a dramatic unveiling, Archie travelled with the police up to Yorkshire to confront his wife. From where Agatha disappeared to where she was found, you're looking at an over 4-hour drive today, and probably significantly longer than that in the 20s. It's said that he took a seat at a corner table in the dining room and watched as Agatha walked in. She took her place at another table and started reading a newspaper, on which the front news was her disappearance. Archie approached his wife, and witnesses would later say that she looked puzzled at this man talking to her, that she showed no recognition whatsoever. A very good actor, or something else entirely. Other sources say that she just welcomed him with a stony stare. The next day, the couple arrived back in London to crowds of people hoping to catch a glimpse, but then she was snuck off to her sister's home in Cheadle, where she was kept in hiding for quite a while, before she eventually sailed off to the Canary Islands to complete her recovery. Agatha Christie never spoke about the days of her disappearance, leaving the general public to wonder for 95 years now. Although actually she did speak to the Daily Mail once in 1928, saying that she was driving past a quarry one day and thought about driving into it, but her daughter was in the car, so she didn't. She said, "That night I felt terribly miserable. I felt that I could go on no longer. I left home that night in a state of high nervous strain with the intention of doing something desperate. When I reached a point on the road which I thought was near the quarry, I turned the car off the road down the hill toward it. I left the wheel and let the car run. The car struck something with a jerk and pulled up suddenly. I was flung against the steering wheel and my head hit something. Up to this moment, I was Mrs. Christie." But even her own autobiography made no reference to those days. So what went on? 2 doctors did diagnose her with an unquestionable and genuine memory loss, and her later biographer thinks she suffered a fugue state, reversible amnesia, but people do still question it. The public at the time were pretty furious about the whole situation. Despite the searches and the pleas for her to be found, when she was found alive, it was bad. They thought it was all either a publicity stunt or an attempt to frame her husband for murder. Who, good news, she did actually finally divorce in April 1928, and he married his mistress just 1 week later. So, what happened? Maybe Agatha did just want to get away, not realising the drama that would be caused by her disappearance. But that doesn't make sense with the scene of her car crash. I personally would hazard a guess that Agatha was pretty depressed. The death of her mother and an incoming divorce would certainly be enough to trigger that. When she went on a drive that night, perhaps she was just in a really bad way, just driving with no particular end destination in mind. Or maybe she did purposefully head towards the quarry, where she had had thoughts about driving into it before. I think she intended to end her own life, but was thwarted by the thick hedges in the way, and her car didn't go down the ditch as planned. And this is where 2 things could have happened. Maybe she seized her opportunity for escape, maybe she walked to a nearby train station or hitchhiked a ride, and then just went wherever the transport was headed. Or maybe she left the car with Yorkshire in mind. She was supposed to be in Yorkshire that weekend anyway for an engagement. There's a chance that Agatha just wanted to get away for a few days, that she needed a break, and while she knew of the search for her, she wasn't in a good enough mind state to particularly care. Or maybe she suffered an injury in the crash. Maybe she hit her head and that caused some sort of temporary memory loss. In a dazed state, she gets out of the car and heads off on her own, somehow ending up in Yorkshire. She signs into a hotel under any name she can think of. I mean, perhaps the name Neil was at the forefront of her mind even in her amnesia state, and she just stayed there. This does sound far-fetched, I'm aware, but many experts over the years have said that they do think it's possible. A recent biographer called Andrew Norman believes that she was in a fugue state, as I mentioned before, which is best described as a period of out-of-body amnesia induced by stress. Maybe the jolt of the car crash was the last straw and Agatha's brain just checked out. Or maybe it wasn't amnesia at all. Maybe she was in the grips of a nervous breakdown, just as her husband had said. In terms of the theories of her trying to frame Archie for murder, you would think as a professional mystery writer she would have come up with a better plan of action than just disappearing. I don't think framing him was ever her intention, and there was nothing to suggest that she had died. She was just missing. Plus, the note she left for her secretary did say she was going for a drive and there was the crashed car, which does suggest that she was alone at the time. I think if she did want to frame her husband for murder, she would have done a bit more than just abandon a car. But then there's the publicity angle, which I don't personally think was the case, but it does hold more weight than the framing for murder theory for me. If Agatha knew that her husband was about to leave her, she was probably panicking a bit about money. And I did mention earlier how Agatha was always worrying about money. She probably knew that she was going to need to be able to keep herself, and to do that, she needed to sell more books. I mean, what's better publicity for a mystery writer than them mysteriously disappearing themselves? But she was a smart woman. She probably knew how this would backfire on her once she made her reappearance. But did it matter? She was always going to sell more books after this, no matter what the public opinion actually was of her. You would think at the very least she would get her secretary in on something like this, tell them what she was planning, but the secretary seemed just as baffled as everyone else and was the only one to actually work properly with the police. I mean, the secretary was certainly much less suspicious than her husband's actions, that's for sure. Archie acted weird. But we'll never know what happened now. Agatha took her secrets with her to the grave, dying aged 85 in 1976. Despite the poor public opinion directly after her reappearance, Agatha's work only went from strength to strength, and she wrote some of her most famous works yet. The Miss Marple series, Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, the ABC murders, and the West End's longest running play, The Mousetrap, which ran continuously from 1952 all the way through to the beginning of the pandemic last year, and now it's back up and running once again. Agatha did go on and eventually get remarried to archaeologist Max Mallowan, and it seems that the rest of her life was lived with little drama. In fact, people completely forgot about this. So, what do you think happened to her? Thank you so much for watching this video. This one's a true classic mystery. A huge thank you once again to Star on Disney Plus for sponsoring this video. Make sure you go check them out down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.